Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Donald Trump has repeatedly claimed that if he were president, this war would never have started. During his 2024 campaign, he promised that once in office, he could end the war in just 24 hours. At one point, he even said he could settle it before officially taking office. Well, the election happened, and on January 20th, 2025, Trump was sworn in as president again. But the war didn't end. When his bold promise failed to materialize, Trump shifted gears. In July 2025, he gave Russian President Vladimir Putin an ultimatum: agree to a peace deal within 50 days or face extremely harsh sanctions. Just weeks later, he revised that ultimatum, saying Putin had only 10 to 12 days to end the war. That deadline came and went with no breakthrough. In mid-August, Trump met Putin in Alaska. But once again, no progress was made. After repeated failures, Trump turned his pressure toward America's allies. According to him, some U.S. allies are far too dependent on Russian oil, and he wants them to stop buying it immediately.
They're my friends, but they're buying oil from Russia. So we can't be expected to be the only ones that are, full bore.
In September, Trump posted on his social media platform, Truth Social, saying he's ready to impose tough sanctions on Russia, but only if NATO countries stop importing Russian oil. He argued that by purchasing oil from Moscow, these countries are actually weakening their own negotiating power. Trump went further, calling for NATO nations not only to cut off Russian oil, but also to slap tariffs of 50 to 100% on Chinese imports, since China is Russia's biggest oil customer. At the end of his post, he warned that if NATO failed to act, this entire effort would be a waste of his time and American taxpayer dollars. Trump repeated the same points in his recent speech at the United Nations. He often boasts that he personally ended 7 wars, and has even suggested he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. But when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, he looks frustrated and powerless. On his recent trip to the United Kingdom, Trump openly admitted disappointment. He said he had believed his personal relationship with Putin would make ending the war easy. Instead, he claims Putin has let him down.
Well, he has let me down. I mean, he's killing many people, and he's losing more people than he's killing. I mean, frankly, the Russian soldiers are being killed at a higher rate than the Ukrainian soldiers. But, he said, let me down. I don't like to see. It's death.
In other words, Trump is now openly airing his frustrations with the Russian leader. That brings us to a critical question. Which NATO countries are still buying Russian oil? Why are they not stopping these purchases? And why does Trump keep targeting them in particular? Will NATO nations really stop buying Russian oil under Trump's pressure? And even if they did, would it actually end the war? Let's break it down. One of the biggest players here is Turkey. It's not a member of the European Union, but it is a NATO country. And Turkey happens to be the 3rd largest buyer of Russian crude oil, after China and India. This explains why Trump talks about NATO countries instead of just saying Europe or the EU. But it's not just Turkey. If you set Turkey aside, the European Union as a whole still ranks as the 4th largest buyer of Russian crude. In August 2025, Turkey alone bought about 6% of Russia's total crude exports, while the EU imported almost the same amount. Inside the EU, 2 countries stand out as the most dependent on Russian oil: Hungary and Slovakia. Both nations receive their oil through the Druzhba pipeline. Before the war, Hungary imported about 61% of its crude oil from Russia. By 2024, that share had actually increased to 86%. In other words, Hungary became even more dependent on Russian oil after the war began. Slovakia, meanwhile, has remained almost completely reliant on Russian crude. Now, could the EU simply force these countries to stop buying Russian oil? Legally, yes. The EU is the body that can impose such a ban. But here's the problem. The countries that could cut ties with Russian oil already did so immediately after the war began. That's why Russian oil's share of EU crude imports has dropped from 27% in 2021 to just about 3% today. And most of that 3% is accounted for by Hungary and Slovakia. So why haven't they stopped? The answer is geography and infrastructure. Both Hungary and Slovakia are landlocked. They don't have seaports, so they can't easily switch suppliers. They've relied for decades on Russian oil delivered directly by pipeline. On top of that, their entire refining infrastructure was built specifically for Russian crude. Switching to other sources would require huge and costly upgrades, which can't happen overnight. That's why the EU gave both countries temporary exemptions, essentially time to diversify supplies and adapt their infrastructure. But instead of moving away from Russian oil, Hungary and Slovakia doubled down and started buying even more because it was cheaper. It's also political. Leaders in both countries are known to have soft spots for Moscow and have consistently opposed the EU's push for tougher sanctions against Russia. And here's the kicker. In order for the EU to impose a full ban on Russian oil, all 27 member states must agree. Hungary and Slovakia can simply veto such a move. That means, practically speaking, the EU cannot force them to stop. Hungary's foreign minister recently made it clear, responding directly to Trump's demands. He said Hungary will not abandon Russian oil under any circumstances. According to him, the country will buy oil from whichever supplier matches their existing infrastructure. And without Russian crude, they simply can't keep the system running. Slovakia's foreign ministry echoed the same position. So, while Trump is pressuring NATO countries, the reality on the ground is far more complicated. Now let's talk about whether NATO, as an alliance, could actually force its members to stop buying Russian oil. The answer is no. NATO is a military alliance. It doesn't make economic decisions. That authority lies with the European Union. Outside the EU, the major NATO members in Europe are the United Kingdom and Turkey. And among them, Turkey is the key player when it comes to Russian oil. Turkey has a unique position. It controls access to the Black Sea. And despite being part of the Western Alliance, it never imposed sanctions on Moscow after the war began. In fact, Turkey increased its imports of Russian oil. Turkish companies buy crude from Russia, refine it, and in some cases even import refined products from Russia, rebrand them, and then sell them to Europe and beyond. This has turned into a hugely profitable business, bringing in millions of dollars. Meanwhile, everyday life in Turkey has grown more expensive. The cost of living has shot up, and President Erdogan's grip on power isn't as firm as it once was. If Turkey stopped buying cheap Russian oil, prices at home would rise even further, fueling unrest and putting Erdogan's government at risk. That's why most experts believe Turkey will resist Trump's demands, even if it means facing heavy pressure from Washington. Although some sources claim Trump even offered Erdogan a return to the F-35 program if Turkey agreed to stop buying Russian oil. So by now, it should be clear. NATO has no power to impose oil sanctions on Russia. That authority belongs to the EU, and even within the EU, as we discussed earlier, there are serious divisions. But Trump's demands don't stop there. In his Truth Social post, he also called on NATO countries to impose tariffs of 50 to 100% on Chinese imports. Why bring China into this? These would be what's called secondary tariffs. Measures meant to punish Beijing for buying so much Russian oil and indirectly funding the war. We've already seen a version of this. Just recently, Washington slapped an additional 25% tariff on Indian goods for the very same reason. India has been a major buyer of Russian oil. So why doesn't the US just impose such heavy tariffs on China itself? Well, it already tried. America fought a tariff war with China not long ago, and Beijing hit back just as hard. Every tariff the US placed on Chinese goods was met with a mirror tariff on American exports. In the end, Washington was forced to roll back many of those tariffs, including the massive 245% duties that had been announced. That's why Trump now wants allies to join in. So the pressure on Beijing would be multilateral and harder for China to ignore. But even here, the picture isn't simple. NATO itself cannot impose tariffs. It's strictly a military body. Only individual member states or the EU as a bloc can do that. Outside the EU, the only big NATO members who could act are Turkey and the United Kingdom. But the UK is deeply tied to China economically. China is Britain's sixth largest trading partner, with nearly $100 billion in bilateral trade in 2024. For China, though, the UK ranks only 16th, meaning Beijing doesn't rely much on Britain. If London imposed tariffs, Beijing would retaliate, hurting the UK economy far more than China's. Turkey, on the other hand, is in no position to pick a trade fight with Beijing either. It depends heavily on Russian oil and doesn't have the economic weight to confront China. That leaves the EU. In theory, the European Union could impose tariffs on China, and unlike oil sanctions, such a move wouldn't require unanimous approval, just a majority vote. But again, politics and economics get in the way. Countries like Germany, the Netherlands, and France have massive economic ties with China. For Germany especially, cheap imports from China are critical for its auto industry and other sectors. Any tariff war with Beijing would likely hurt the EU more than it would hurt China, since China would hit back with retaliatory tariffs. That's why experts believe the EU is highly unlikely to go down this road. So what does that mean? In all likelihood, NATO countries will continue buying Russian crude. Even if they stopped completely, it wouldn't break Russia's economy. NATO as a whole accounts for only about 12% of Russian oil exports. Moscow could easily redirect that supply to China, India, or other markets. We've already seen this play out. The EU slashed its Russian oil imports from 27% in 2021 to just 3% today. Yet Russia's economy kept growing. In 2024, despite hundreds of US and European sanctions, Russia reported GDP growth of 4.1%, 4 times the growth rate of the G7 nations. Ukraine, on the other hand, is under enormous strain. It has already lost around 20% of its territory. Recently, President Volodymyr Zelensky admitted that while ending the war remains his plan A, he also has a plan B, preparing to fight on through 2026. For that, he says Ukraine will need about $120 billion. Half of that, he claims, could be covered domestically, but the other $60 billion would have to come from Western allies. To put that in perspective, $60 billion is roughly 1/3 of Ukraine's entire GDP. It's also a huge ask for allies, considering that since the war began, European countries have already spent $165 billion, while the US Department of Defense reports that America has spent $180 billion. Keeping up that level of support indefinitely will be politically and financially difficult for any government. And remember, in this video we only talked about crude oil, not Russian gas. The EU still buys a large share of its natural gas from Russia, through both pipelines and LNG shipments. Many of these contracts are long-term and legally binding, making them much harder to break quickly. So the big questions remain. Will Trump succeed in pushing NATO allies to abandon Russian oil? Can he rally Europe into a tariff war against China? Or is this ultimately out of Washington's hands, with the real decision lying in Moscow and Beijing? What do you think? Will Trump manage to stop this war, or does it all depend on when Putin decides he's ready? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dive videos like this. And let us know what topics you'd like us to cover next. Thanks for watching.